When Emperor Puyi ascended to the Chinese throne in 1908, his life of luxury seemed assured. But history, it seems, has a way of changing even the best laid plans. Within 4 years, his country had become a republic and the emperor found himself out of a job. Born into the Qing dynasty, the son of Prince Chun became ruler rather unexpectedly. As a member of China's royal family, Puyi would undoubtedly have lived a luxurious life under any circumstances. But when he was a toddler, a decision was made that changed his life forever. 3 months shy of Puyi's 3rd birthday in November of 1908, a royal contingent entered his family's home. Consisting of guards and servants, they informed Puyi's father, Prince Chun, that his son was to become the Chinese emperor. And with that, they took Puyi away. The young boy was forcibly removed from his parents because of a decision made by the dying Empress Cixi. In fact, Puyi had been chosen without the knowledge of his immediate family. Yet the child was now to take the reins of the country that the Qing dynasty had ruled for over 300 years. The boy was taken to the royal palace in Beijing, also known as the Forbidden City. Within a month, Puyi was officially proclaimed Emperor of China. During his inauguration, the loud drums and music were too much for the toddler, and he reportedly burst into tears. From then on, Puyi's every need was catered for by an army of servants. Sumptuous banquets were served at every meal, and every new day brought new clothes. The servants bowed while grown men fell to their knees as the youngster passed. Anyone who's ever raised a child knows that never being told no doesn't make for a well-balanced human being. Being emperor, however, meant that the little boy couldn't be told off, punished, or reprimanded in any way. This led to Puyi becoming something of a spoiled sadist. As emperor, Puyi relied on his servants to do everything for him. Washing, dressing, opening doors, even blowing on hot soup were all jobs for his attendants. Just taking a walk in the palace gardens involved multiple servants carrying a change of clothes and afternoon tea. Another would notify any non-royals in the proximity to remove themselves. These servants who ran the Forbidden City were in fact slaves, but the palace had a very particular form of slave. They were all eunuchs. And in order to prove that they were indeed eunuchs, they were forced to wear a pendant containing their excised body parts. Clearly considered inferior by the young emperor, they bore the brunt of his bullying behavior. There are numerous stories of Puyi's cruel treatment of his servants, and he himself later came to regret his behavior. He used to shoot his air rifle at them, give them daily floggings, and even had one beaten to death. Working for the young king, it seems, was a dangerous business. However, by the 2nd decade of the 20th century, the Qing dynasty's sphere of influence was diminishing. Public feeling at the time was beginning to turn against an absolute ruler, and October 1911 proved to be the beginning of the end for the family's reign. Following an uprising in the valleys of the river Yangtze, imperial forces were unable to quell the ill feeling towards the royals, and so a deal was negotiated between the Qings and the burgeoning Republican movement. Under the terms, Puyi would no longer be Emperor of China. The 2 centuries-long rule of the Qing dynasty had, in essence, come to an end. Well, the terms of the agreement meant that Puyi would have to abdicate. However, he was still able to retain his title. He continued to live at the royal palace, and life for the young man went on almost as normal. In fact, no one actually told him that he wasn't the country's leader anymore. As late as 1914, it became clear to Puyi that something had changed. The agreement, as it turned out, had been temporary and had been put in place for one specific reason. China's then president, Yuan Shikai, had imperial dreams of his own. He made himself the de facto ruler of the country, but he himself was forced to abdicate in 1916. He died later that year. Shikai's abdication and death left room for royalists to mobilize and attempt to reinstall Puyi. And for a brief period in July of 1917, they were successful. The emperor was indeed on his throne once again. Sadly for the young king, though, it didn't last. When the Republican leadership got wind of the reinstated ruler, troops besieged the Forbidden City. The royalists were heavily outnumbered and were defeated during an attack on the palace on July 12th. Puyi was once again relegated to citizen. Following the failed restoration, life once again went on almost as normal. Puyi retained the services of a British tutor, and in 1922 he married a bride he'd never seen before. It was during this time that he came to the attention of the Japanese government. Relations between Japan and China had been fraught for centuries, and Puyi himself did little to ease the tensions. However, following a devastating earthquake in Japan in 1923, he sent thousands of dollars worth of artifacts to fund aid efforts. In return, Japanese diplomats visited him and reported that he was self-involved and easily manipulated. This was the beginning of a doomed relationship between Puyi and Imperial Japan. In 1924, Puyi was once again forced to leave the royal palace by another uprising. The emperor was given just 3 hours to flee the Forbidden City, and after being pursued through Beijing, he ended up at the Japanese embassy. From the embassy, Puyi went into exile in the city of Tianjin. Now 19 years old, he was allowed a social life for the first time and became something of a philanderer. Despite his high-flying new life, however, he never gave up hope of one day returning to power. So when an opportunity presented itself, he grabbed it. In 1931, Japan invaded an area of northeastern China known as Manchuria. The Japanese planned to establish a puppet state here called Manchukuo, and they saw that Puyi could prove useful. And so that year, Puyi moved back to China to prepare for being installed as Emperor of Manchukuo. The ceremony took place in March of 1934, and this time around there were no tears. Puyi did, however, clash with his new Japanese masters over the choice of outfit for his coronation. He ended up wearing a British military uniform when his handlers wouldn't allow him to wear the traditional yellow robes of a Qing emperor. Although forced on the local population, Japanese authorities claimed that Puyi's installation in Manchukuo had a community-minded purpose. Having been left lawless by its previous warlord ruler, the region was notoriously dangerous. The occupying forces pushed the idea that the new emperor could help clean up the streets. Puyi, of course, did no such thing. Indeed, his presence actually allowed things to get much worse. From the state's very beginning, organized crime flourished. State-sponsored gangs and the police were free to do as they desired. The emperor simply acted as a distraction for the people. One particular incident highlighted just how intertwined the Japanese state had become with the crime gangs. Simon Casp, a Jewish piano player from France, was murdered in Manchukuo in 1933. There to see his father, Casp met a brutal death at the hands of a group of Russian anti-Semites. During the investigation into Casp's murder, it became clear that while a Russian gang had committed the crime, they hadn't been working alone. They had in fact been given royal approval, not by Puyi, however, but by the Japanese Imperial Army. Puyi himself was in essence a prisoner within the palace in Manchukuo. His days tended to consist of resting, tennis matches, and listening to music. He had no knowledge, it seems, of the world outside, nor of the political tensions rising throughout Asia and Europe. But Puyi was also a puppet head of state, and as such he signed decrees into law when he was told to. In 1937, he supported the Japanese at the beginning of the Second Sino-Japanese War, and that same year he condemned millions to enslavement by signing a decree allowing for slave labor within Manchukuo. 2 years after the Second World War broke out in Europe, Japan declared war on Britain and the United States, and so Puyi followed suit. However, as a mouthpiece for and seemingly believer in Japanese propaganda, he remained unaware of the realities of the conflict. Puyi spent practically the whole war behind closed doors, but in 1944 he began to have an inkling that things weren't going well. His suspicions were confirmed in August of 1945 when the Soviet Union declared war on Japan. Shortly thereafter, Soviet troops swarmed into Manchukuo. On August 15, 1945, one day after Japan surrendered and ended the conflict in the Pacific, Puyi once again abdicated. In his final act as ruler, he returned Manchuria to China. And after an escape attempt by rail had been aborted, he fled the region by air. He went, of course, to Japan. Fleeing to meet his plane, Puyi left behind his wife and companion of more than 20 years. She was soon captured attempting to escape to Korea and was jailed. The former empress died from starvation in prison less than a year later. The end of the war went slightly differently for Puyi. Captured by the Soviets on his way to Japan, the disgraced former emperor was kept in relative comfort, and despite repeated requests from the Chinese, the Soviets refused to hand him over to be tried for treason. Instead, the ex-ruler was allowed to visit Tokyo, ironically, to testify against the Japanese in a war crimes hearing. After 5 years as a captive in Russia, Puyi finally went back to China in 1950. Once there, though, he wasn't put on trial. Instead, the country's new leader, Mao Zedong, wanted the emperor to be educated in the virtues of communism. He was taken to a center for war criminals in Manchuria, where his rehabilitation could begin. Here, Puyi was completely on his own for the first time. Even in the Russian prison, he had slaves. Perhaps understandably, simple things fazed the ex-emperor. Indeed, other prisoners snickered at his attempts to brush his own teeth or tie his laces. Lessons about communism filled Puyi's years at the center. However, being forced to come face to face with people who had been born the horrors of his puppet regime affected him most. Indeed, midway through his incarceration at the center, the former royal was reportedly suicidal. After almost 10 years of captivity and education, Puyi was deemed sufficiently rehabilitated and was allowed to return to Beijing. In 1959, he took a job as a street cleaner and even paid a visit to his old home in the Forbidden City. This time, however, he had to purchase an entrance ticket, as the palace had become a museum in 1925. He later went on to work at the city's botanical gardens, living on site in a simple shack. After leaving the gardens, China's final emperor earned around $4 a month working for the government. In 1964, he published his autobiography, From Emperor to Citizen. He became something of a celebrity in his later years, often giving glowing appraisals of communism during press conferences. Puyi's celebrity was short-lived, though, and he died in 1967 from kidney cancer. 20 years after his death, his life was immortalized in the Oscar-winning movie The Last Emperor. However, critics argued that the film glossed over many of the more detestable aspects of his story. Today, China is perhaps less ashamed of its imperial history, turning many royal sites into museums and national monuments. There are even plans to make Puyi's shack at the Botanical Gardens into a visitor attraction, displaying the tools he used while working there. Indeed, this exhibit would serve merely as a snapshot into the fascinating and erratic life of the final emperor of China.